welcome to the Dancing Druid. I am Root. Today I will talk about the history of the ancient Druids, and about the Celtic peoples that they emerged from. For historical understanding of the ancient Druids, I am informed primarily by Peter Beresford Ellis, a historian and author of numerous books about the Celts. It is my aim in this video to give a general sense of what their society looked like, as well as illuminate some lesser-known interesting aspects about them. I will also set the record straight about some of the lies that have been told about Druids. Before we delve into the history of the ancient Celts and Druids, we must look at the origin of the word Druid, which, according to many leading Celtic etymologists, derives from the root words dru and wid. Dru meaning oak, and wid meaning to know or to see, as in the Sanskrit word vid, from which we get the word video. Indeed, the ancient Sanskrit and ancient Celtic languages share many commonalities, hinting at their common Indo-European origin. So, Druid means oak knowledge, or oak vision. Oak trees provide highly nutritious, easily stored food with their acorns, and wherever it grows, it is highly regarded by indigenous peoples. Not only does it provide food, but oak wood is a strong building material, beautiful when carved, and it is the best kind of firewood, burning long and hot, useful in forging metal and firing clay. It is a long-lived and hardy tree with deep roots, able to regrow from the stump after being cut, and host to mistletoe, sacred to the Druids, because it appeared to be a plant that does not grow on the ground, but in the sky. To have knowledge of the trees was to have wisdom, which was why the Druids were called the wise ones of the oak. The Celts in general were called the Celtori by the Greeks, meaning the hidden people. Perhaps it was because they blended with the land in the vast primeval forests of ancient Europe, or because the Greeks considered them to be reclusive. The Druids were known to the Greeks as the intellectual class of Celtic society. Celtic nations varied in size. The Helvetii, who lived in what is now Switzerland, numbered 390,000 when they began migrating to other lands. The Celts lived across Europe as far east as present-day Turkey, and they were a people united by language, tradition, and philosophy. The Celtic law systems handed down orally were highly cultivated and showed parallels to the Hindu law systems. Celtic society was largely rural in character, consisting of clusters of houses scattered across the countryside, and these households were organized into kin groups. The kin group is a set of people sharing some familial relationship, whether by blood or by adoption. The term for kin group in Proto-Celtic is kennitlum. Each household in a kennitlum was encouraged to be as self-sufficient as possible, but fell back on the wider kin group as an insurance policy. Households could draw from the common resources of the kin group when an individual or a household did not have sufficient means. On the other hand, the kin group could intervene when a member's business put others in the kin group at risk. Two or more kennitlums formed confederations, which Caesar referred to with the Roman term civitas, meaning tribe or nation. Sometimes these confederations elected a vergobret, or magistrate, to preside over disputes. By the time Caesar went to Gaul, there was a mixture of inherited and elected rulers and governing councils in various Celtic nations. Caesar noted that the chief druid of Gaul was elected by their peers. One of the great skills developed by the Celts was their road building, an understanding now well supported by archaeological finds of sophisticated Celtic roads. Even many Latin words for transport are derived from Celtic words. When Rome would later conquer Celtic lands, they claimed the credit for building them, and constructed their vast trading network on a backbone of Celtic roadways. While the Romans certainly built many roads of their own, much of it with slave labor, the myth of Roman road building is yet another part of Roman propaganda. Archaeology has also demonstrated the prosperity of ancient Celtic farming communities, as well as their sophistication in art, in pottery, jewelry making, enamel work, advanced metalwork, all of which was highly prized by Mediterranean nations. During the 1st century before Caesar's first attempted invasion of Britain, British woolen goods were eagerly sought in Rome, especially woolen cloaks, sagae, which is evident in preserved Roman financial records, demonstrating just how much propaganda Caesar worked when he wrote that the British Celts knew nothing of weaving. Most of the written accounts about the Druids that have survived the ages were written by Romans. most notably Caesar, the very person who waged against the Druids the bloodiest war in Roman history, the very person whose cruelty against the Celts is legendary. As such, his account can hardly be taken without question. As I mentioned, there were also Greek writers who spoke of the Druids among the Celts, but Greece was also a culture extremely hostile towards the Celts, so what they wrote about them is also not without prejudice. These Greek and Latin writers wrote all manner of things about the Celts and the Druids in condescending, cynical arrogance. Caesar wrote that the ordinary Celtic people were treated almost like slaves by the Druids and the warrior class of Celtic society, even though other sources contradict this. Indeed, native sources indicate the exact opposite. In Caesar, we find the conqueror fabricating justification for his invasion, for if the people are being treated like slaves by their own rulers, then the conquest can be spun as a war of liberation. Caesar claimed that the Druids engaged in barbaric human sacrifice, and this was a caricature of the Druids that, sadly, is still used to this day. It is only the arrogance of Roman imperialists that would have us believe that Romans would be shocked and appalled by human sacrifice. Even before Rome, Greek literature is full of mentions of human sacrifice customs. The Romans took it to the next level. In the time of the late Republic and early Empire, children in Rome were sacrificed in rites to conjure the spirits of the dead. And then there are the Roman games, where prisoners and slaves were forced to fight to the death to entertain the masses. In the time when the empire was supposedly at its greatest, in the course of any given day, about 300 prisoners had to fight each other to the death, and 1,200 men and women, condemned by law, were slaughtered, most of them killed by starving wild animals. Considering this, we can look at the Roman expression of profound disgust and distaste for human sacrifice as applied to the Druids as meaningless except as an act of disingenuous political propaganda. To help us understand why there was such passionate hostility between these two sets of cultures, the historian Peter Ellis makes reference to Professor Jean Markle, where in his work, La Femme Celte, he writes, "When Rome spread its empire over the whole Mediterranean and into part of Western Europe, care was taken to eliminate anything that might harm its socio-political organization. This is very evident in Celtic countries. The Romans pursued the Druids until they disappeared into Gaul and later into Britain. The Druids represented an absolute threat to the Roman state because their science and philosophy dangerously contradicted Roman orthodoxy. The Romans were materialistic, the Druids spiritual. For the Romans, the state was a monolithic structure spread over territories deliberately organized into a hierarchy. With the Druids, it was a freely consented moral order with an entirely mythical central idea. The Romans based their law on private ownership of land with property rights entirely vested in the head of the family, whereas the Druids always considered ownership collective. The Romans looked upon women as bearers of children and objects of pleasure, while the Druids included women in their political and religious life." One way in which Druidic Celtic society differed from almost every other culture of its time was the freedom and privileges shared by womenfolk. In ancient Greece, women had no political rights. They could not hold any positions of power. They could not inherit nor own property, or enter into any transaction worth more than the value of a bushel of grain. If a woman's father died without a male heir, the daughter went with his property to the next of male kin. In the Roman era, women were allowed more rights than in Greece, but they still could not own property. A man still had complete control over his wife, and women needed to have a male guardian to conduct affairs of business. In Celtic society during these same time periods, there are numerous examples of women who were leaders of their people, the most famous of which is Boudica, bringer of victory. She was a warrior priestess of great renown who led the resistance against the Second Roman invasion and occupation under the infamously ruthless Emperor Nero. Warrior queens appear in many Celtic stories, such as Maeve of Connacht, who commanded an army and personally killed the famous warrior Cethrin in combat. There are other notable women who were champions in battle, such as Sathak, who was the principal instructor of the martial arts to Cuchulainn. In the Brehon law system, women could be found in many professions, even as druids, prophets, bards, comedians, doctors, lawyers, and judges. Women could own property, kept her property in a divorce, and women could divorce their husbands for any reason, and they had the right to succession in noble families. If a woman's husband had committed a crime or fallen from his dignity, it did not affect the position of his wife. A woman was responsible for her own debts and not those of her husband. Greeks and Romans could not understand the freedom of Celtic women, nor the Celts' more open attitude to sexual relationships. In their own societies, women were treated as little more than chattel to be bought and sold. Greek and Roman men feared the influence of Celtic ideas. This is not to say that the Celts had an ideal society. The ancient ways of the mother goddess came under assault from more patriarchal cultures for centuries, and gradually, male warrior society came to replace earlier Celtic traditions. When Rome imposed Christianity upon the Celts, it completed the disintegration of what once had been equality between men and women. It is only within the past 100 years that the same level of equality has been attained between men and women once more in Celtic culture. The ancient Celts have been represented, particularly by Greek and Roman sources, as a fierce warrior society, proud, ignorant, illiterate, taking life cheaply, given to childish amusements and often drunk. They have often been depicted as noble savages, even in modern times. It is a stereotype that has been applied to indigenous people everywhere by colonial cultures. This is not to say that Roman and Greek sources are totally useless, for there are certain things that can be pieced together as they are corroborated from other sources. For example, we can confirm that the Celts were advanced in the art of metallurgy, and that they had iron weapons superior to that of the Romans. In fact, the famous Roman gladius was adopted by the Romans from the Celts, and the Latin words for the javelin, lancia, and the chariot, carus, are derived from Celtic words. The Celts were legendary horse riders and were skillful charioteers. The Romans adopted many cavalry tactics from them and conscripted Celtic cavalry units after they conquered Gaul. After the fall of Rome, Celtic lifeways centered around druidic philosophy continued in Irish society through the Middle Ages. Courts and the law were largely anarchist and operated in a purely stateless manner. These last holdouts of Celtic culture successfully upheld social egalitarianism after the fall of Rome for 1,000 years. Their philosophy promoted personal sovereignty based on individual free will, while at the same time upholding responsibility to community. This lasted until its conquest by England in the 17th century. English writers noted that there was no legislature, no bailiffs, no police, no public enforcement of justice. There was no trace of state-administered justice, and it was not needed. It was all handled by autonomous communities. In Celtic Ireland, all professionals and people who presided over land were entitled to become members of a tuath. Each tuath's members formed an annual assembly which decided all common policies, declared war or peace, and elected or deposed their kings. No one was stuck or bound to a given tuath, either because of kinship or where they lived. Individual members were free to, and often did, secede from a tuath and join another tuath. The sum total of the landed properties of its members constituted its territorial boundaries. The king of any region had no political power. These royal families could not make decrees or declare war. Basically, these kings were priests and militia leaders and presided over the tuath assemblies. The Celtic expression of a freely consented moral order shares many similarities with post-colonial anarchism, which approaches the same principles of mutual aid, opposition to social hierarchy, and community-level self-management. In present time, these revelations have brought on a new movement called Celtic anarchism, which seeks inspiration for anarchism in the history and practices of tribal cultures, rather than relying solely on political theory. On a final note, the Celts were not completely wiped out. They are still here, and the Celtic language is still spoken by millions, mostly in the Celtic nations. The Druids were not wiped out either, but adapted as their nations were conquered and shaped by opposing forces. They became seers and teachers under Roman rule, and later Christianized as priests so that they could pass on the wisdom of their people under a different guise. I am as inspired by their resilience as I am about their philosophy, and I hope you are inspired to learn more as well. thank you for listening. Until next time, you have all my very best wishes for your peace and happiness.